the wedding vows shattered with the cry of a baby. Inside the whitewashed church of Dry Creek, the sound ripped through the air like thunder, freezing every breath, silencing the priest mid-sentence. Heads turned as a servant girl stepped from the side chamber, pale and trembling, a swaddled infant clutched to her chest. The wail rolled across the crowded pews, louder than the rustle of stiff dresses and the flutter of lace fans. At the altar, Eliza Whitfield's bouquet slipped from her hands. She stood in a gown of yellowed lace, her body rigid with dread. Her family's last hope for survival, this marriage to wealthy merchant Thomas Hale, collapsed before her eyes. Outside, the desert sun scorched at 95 degrees F, pressing its heat against the whitewashed walls, yet Eliza felt colder than winter stone. The congregation stirred. "Eliza has a child," hissed one voice. "A bastard," came another, sharp as a knife. Mothers pulled daughters closer. Men muttered of shame. Her parents sat motionless until, unable to bear the weight of disgrace, they turned their backs and walked away. Thomas's face twisted with fury. "You lied to me," he thundered, ripping the ring from his pocket and throwing it at her feet. "You expect me to raise another man's bastard? There will be no wedding." His words cracked like a whip, the sound echoing through stone walls as the priest lowered his gaze. Eliza's knees buckled. She stumbled from the altar, clutching her child to her chest, sobs breaking beneath the cruel laughter that swept the pews. Tears blurred her vision as she collapsed at the church steps, the infant's whimper her only anchor. Then, silence. Bootsteps broke the hush, slow and measured. A shadow stretched across the aisle, broad-shouldered against the flickering candles. Caleb Ward, a rancher known for solitude, had stood near the back, silent as always. Weathered by miles of dust and sun, his gray eyes cut steady through the crowd's jeers. He stopped beside the disgraced bride and her crying child. For a long breath, he said nothing. Then his voice came low, gravel-rough but steady, carrying across the stunned congregation. "She'll sleep under my roof tonight." The room stilled. Some scoffed, others muttered, but none stepped forward to challenge him. Eliza lifted her tear-streaked face, trembling fingers meeting his calloused hand. The world she had known had turned to ash, but in that moment, one truth rose from the silence. She was no longer alone. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe Dust and Destiny now and ride with us to the very end. Rain swept across the desert as Caleb Ward led Eliza from the church, her child pressed tight against her chest. The jeers still echoed behind them, spilling from the open doors into the storm. Lightning split the sky, throwing the crooked street into flashes of white. And for a moment, Eliza saw the townsfolk clustered at the windows, faces sharp with scorn. Her gown clung heavy to her skin, lace sodden, flowers plastered to her hair. Every step felt like sinking into mud, until Caleb's steady hand guided her forward. At the hitch rail, his horse stamped and snorted, tossing its mane against the rain. Caleb swung into the saddle in a single motion, then reached down, gray eyes unblinking. Eliza hesitated, but the crowd's hiss carried even through the storm. She placed her trembling hand in his, and with one pull, he lifted her and the child up before him. As they turned into the street, a knot of men stepped into their path, farmers and merchants emboldened by the shadows of numbers. One spat into the mud. "You're dragging shame under your roof, Ward. Best leave her here." Another man reached for the hem of Eliza's gown, sneering. The Colt cleared leather before the hand could touch. Caleb's revolver, slick with rain, gleamed in the lightning flash. He didn't raise his voice, only leveled his gaze at the crowd. "You'll not touch them." The words were plain, gravel deep, but in them lay the weight of miles ridden, nights endured alone under the stars, and a silence men had learned not to challenge. The hands withdrew. The men stepped back. Caleb holstered the gun in one fluid motion, nudged his horse forward, and no one barred the way again. Eliza clutched her child, heart hammering. She had seen men shout, threaten, curse, but never a man stand so still, and in stillness command more than rage could. Her father had bargained her away. Thomas had spit fury, yet this stranger offered no bargain, no fury, only protection. Why? The question circled in her chest like a bird beating wings against its cage. The miles stretched long across the flats, 12 of them through storm and shadow. Each hoofbeat drummed steady beneath the wind, each gust of rain chilled to the bone. Caleb's coat shielded her shoulders, rough wool smelling of smoke and leather. She pressed her cheek to its coarse weave, and for the first time since the altar, her sobs began to still. The child whimpered, then drifted into uneasy sleep against her breast. When at last the homestead rose out of darkness, it was no grand estate, but a squat house of weathered timber, its roof patched in places, fences stretching toward a corral where cattle huddled against the storm. A lantern glowed faint in the window, flickering like a star that refused to die. Caleb dismounted, boots sinking into the mud, and turned to lift Eliza down as if she weighed nothing. She stood trembling in the rain, her dress heavy, her lips parting to speak thanks or apology, but no words came. His silence swallowed them whole. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and leather, the hearth dark but waiting. A scarred table stood near the fire pit, jars lined the shelves, and a rifle leaned against the corner. Home of a man who asked little of life but labor and solitude. Caleb struck a match, coaxed flame to kindling, then laid a log onto the fire. Shadows leapt across the walls, warming the room with each crackle. Eliza held the child close at the doorway, confusion twisting with gratitude. Why would he do this? Why risk the judgment of an entire town for a woman disgraced and a babe not his? She studied his movements, the way he mended a broken window latch so the wind would not creep through, the way he laid a folded blanket on the bed as if such care were second nature. His silence was not emptiness. It was choice, deliberate. And though she could not name it yet, Eliza felt that within that silence was something stronger than any vow spoken at the altar she had left behind. The storm passed, leaving the desert washed clean and the air sharp with sage. Days at the ranch fell into a quiet rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, his boots scuffing the packed earth as he moved out to the corral, the low bellow of cattle carrying across the flats. Eliza would watch from the doorway, her child nestled in her arms, the faint glow of the fire warming her back. The house itself was modest but steady. Each morning Caleb returned with dust clinging to his coat, setting tools by the door before moving to tend small repairs. He said little, yet his silence never pressed upon her like judgment. It felt instead like shelter, like the pause between heartbeats. When the baby whimpered, Caleb heated a strip of cloth by the fire and handed it to her without a word, his gray eyes softening as the child settled. When her dress tore at the sleeve, she found it folded neatly on the chair, clumsy stitches drawn by rough hands built for reins and rope. She traced those threads with her fingers, tears stinging her eyes. It was in such gestures, small, deliberate, unspoken, that Eliza began to sense the difference in him. Men in Dry Creek had mocked with words, threatened with fists, bargained with gold. Caleb did none of these. His silence was not emptiness, but a choice, a language of patience and endurance. Yet silence left room for memory, and memory came unbidden. At night, as the baby slept, Eliza would sit near the hearth, staring into the flames until smoke stung her eyes. She remembered Daniel, the cowboy who once promised her a patch of land and a home built from sweat and dust. His laughter had been warm, his hands rough but tender when he brushed hair from her cheek. They had walked miles of desert together, dreaming of cattle and a creekside pasture, until the day Thomas Monroe rode in with papers and coin, demanding the land Daniel had fought to claim. Daniel refused. And one night, shots split the darkness. She had run to the sound, the smell of blood heavy in the air. Daniel's body broken in the dust. Her parents' fear turned quickly to desperation. Debts mounted like storm clouds. When Thomas returned, offering marriage in exchange for salvation, they begged her to accept. "Think of the family," they said. And so she buried her grief, hid her child, and walked to the altar with hands trembling, prepared to trade her life for survival. But survival had betrayed her. and at the church steps her secret had been torn into the open. One evening, her breath caught in her throat as she whispered the truth to the firelight. Caleb sat across the room, sharpening a blade, his face carved with shadow. He listened, jaw tight, but did not interrupt. When her voice broke, when she pressed her face into her hands, his silence held steady. At length, he set the blade aside, his rough voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. My brother wanted land too, a patch near the river. Merchants came with papers signed by sheriffs who never saw the soil. He stood against them. They put him in the ground and called it justice. Eliza lifted her head, her eyes searching his. His gaze was steady, but she saw the storm beneath it. The grief banked like coals. For a moment she felt the weight of his silence not as distance, but as shared ground. An understanding carved from loss. The baby stirred, and Caleb crossed the room, crouching beside her chair. His scarred hand brushed the quilt, not touching the child, but close enough that Eliza felt the quiet strength in the gesture. Her throat tightened. For the first time, she did not feel like a woman confessing shame, but like someone heard. Later, as dawn crept pale over the horizon, Eliza stood at the doorway, the desert stretching endless before her. Caleb saddled his horse, the leather creaking under his grip. She watched the way he moved, deliberate and calm, as if every action carried weight. Something stirred faintly in her memory. A face glimpsed once before at a distance, Daniel speaking of a rancher he had crossed paths with along the borderlands, a man who rode silent but fair. The thought lodged in her chest like a seed. She said nothing, not yet, but the silence between them no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken, waiting to take root. The desert night pressed close against the ranch house, the wind whispering at the shutters like a restless spirit. Inside, the fire burned low, painting faint red across the walls. Eliza lay on the narrow bed, her baby cradled against her breast. At first, sleep had come easily, exhaustion pulling her down, but soon shadows reached into her dreams. She stirred, murmurs slipping from her lips. "No, Daniel, don't." Her body twisted, arms tightening around her child. "The land! Blood everywhere!" Her voice cracked into sobs, the sound raw and broken. Across the room, Caleb sat in a chair by the window, hat pulled low, rifle resting across his knees. Sleep rarely found him. He listened to the wind, to the creak of wood, to the fragile rhythm of breaths. But at the sound of her dream, his jaw clenched, gray eyes narrowing. He rose, set the rifle aside, and crossed the room with boots whispering against the floorboards. At the bedside, he paused, his shadow long across the wall. "Eliza," he said quietly, his voice gravel rough but steady. She woke with a start, eyes wide, chest heaving. "You called a name," he said, not unkindly. "Daniel." Her face drained of color. She held the child closer, shaking her head as if silence might erase what he'd heard. But Caleb's gaze did not waver. "Tell me the truth." For a long moment she sat frozen, words trapped behind clenched teeth. At last her shoulders sagged as though a burden too heavy had slipped at last from her grip. Tears filled her eyes. "Daniel was the man I loved," she whispered. "A cowboy, poor but kind. We dreamed of land, of a herd of our own. He worked from dawn until his hands bled, but he believed we could carve a life from dust. Then Thomas came. He wanted that land, tried to buy it. Daniel refused. And one night," her voice broke, trembling. "Gunfire. Men paid to settle what money could not. I ran to him, but he was already gone. The ground drank his blood before I could even hold him." Her sobs shuddered into the silence. Caleb stood still, the muscles of his jaw flexing. At length his voice came low, like stone grinding against stone. "My brother wanted land too, a patch by the river. Merchants waved papers signed by sheriffs who never set foot on the soil. He stood his ground. They put him under it, called it justice." Eliza's breath caught. She raised her eyes to his, seeing not pity but recognition, the raw edge of wounds that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice shaking. "I should never have—" He cut her off gently. "Don't." His gaze held hers, unflinching. "You don't carry the blame for men like them." The room grew still, the fire's crackle the only sound. In that stillness, something shifted. Her grief, long buried beneath shame and silence, poured out without fear of judgment. His grief, though veiled, stood beside hers like a pillar of stone. For the first time since the church steps, she felt not condemned, not alone, but understood. The baby stirred, fussing against her chest. Eliza tried to hush him, but her arms shook with exhaustion. Caleb moved closer, his broad frame casting shadow over them both. "Here," he said simply, holding out his arms. Hesitant, she let the child slip into his scarred hands. He cradled the infant with surprising gentleness, settling into the chair by the fire. Large fingers traced soothing circles across the small back. Then, almost under his breath, Caleb began to hum. A low, steady tune, rough as gravel yet carrying the calm of nights under endless skies. The melody wound through the room, threading past the walls, rising above the storm outside. Slowly, the baby's cries softened, eyelids fluttering until sleep reclaimed him. Eliza watched, tears streaking her cheeks, her heart trembling at the sight of the silent rancher, his revolver still at his hip, but his arms steady around a child who was not his voice humming lullabies meant to chase shadows away. In that fragile moment, peace settled like dust after a storm. Not a promise, not a vow, but a truth as real as the fire's glow. Grief had not broken them, it had bound them. Morning broke pale and cool, the desert stretching wide under a sky washed clean by storm. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, her shawl pulled close, the baby bundled against her chest. Caleb was already at the corral, his broad back bent over the saddle cinch, breath steady in the chill air. She watched him for a moment, her heart caught between gratitude and the old reflex of shame. He came back later with dust clinging to his boots, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Without a word, he set down a tin cup of water on the table and reached into the pocket of his coat. When his hand came out, it held something small and worn, a pocket knife, the wood of its handle smooth from years of use. He turned it once in his palm, then placed it gently on the table between them. Eliza blinked, confused. I can't take that." Caleb's gray eyes lifted, steady. "It was my brother's. Carried it every mile he walked, every fence he mended. After they put him in the ground, it was all they handed back to me." His voice was low, not bitter but carved with memory. "I kept it in my pocket, thinking maybe it would keep me from forgetting." Her hand trembled as she reached toward it. The handle was warm from his palm, the blade nicked with use. She felt the weight of it, light in the hand, but heavy with history. "Why give it to me?" she whispered. Caleb leaned against the post, arms folded, gaze fixed on her with quiet certainty. "Because you've been carrying your shame like it's yours alone. But it ain't. This knife, it's not for hiding. It's for remembering what we stand for, what they couldn't take, no matter how deep they tried to bury it." Eliza swallowed hard. Her instinct was to tuck it away, to slip it under cloth where no one could see. But something in his voice, steady as the land itself, stopped her. Slowly, she set the knife on the table in the open, where the morning light caught its metal. For the first time, she did not hide. Caleb's eyes softened. He pushed off the post and stepped closer, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. His words came rough, almost gravel breaking in his throat, but true as iron. "You're not dirt, Eliza. You're stronger than the men who tried to bury you." Her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from shame. They were born of release, of something fragile rising where despair had lived. She lifted her chin, letting the morning light touch her face without flinching. The baby stirred against her chest, and she pressed a kiss to its soft hair, the knife gleaming beside them like a small flame of memory. Later, when she stepped outside to hang laundry on the line, she carried the knife openly at her side, the leather thong looped through her sash. The neighbors might whisper, the town might scorn, but she no longer felt the need to hide. Each step across the dirt yard felt steadier, her back straighter. Caleb watched from the corral, his expression unreadable but his stance relaxed, as though something inside him had eased. She had not returned the knife, nor did he ask. It was no longer a relic of his brother alone. It had become a symbol of survival, of shared strength, of dignity reclaimed. That night, as the fire burned low, Eliza laid the knife on the mantel. Her fingers brushed the handle once, then stilled. She looked across the room at Caleb, his head bent as he worked a strip of leather, and in his silence she heard something unspoken but certain. The past was still theirs, but it no longer chained them. It anchored them. The peace did not last. By late summer, the desert air grew brittle with heat. The ground cracked beneath the hooves of riders who came not to trade or visit, but to claim what Thomas Monroe still believed his. It began at dusk, the sky painted red as a forge fire. Caleb noticed the dust first, a low cloud rolling across the flats. He set down the bridle he'd been mending, his jaw tightening. From the doorway, Eliza followed his gaze. "Riders?" she whispered. Caleb's hand brushed the revolver at his hip. Thomas's men. The hoofbeats swelled into thunder. 5, maybe 6, cutting hard across the land, rifles glinting in the dying sun. Eliza's stomach clenched. She gathered her child close, heart hammering. The first shots shattered the quiet. Glass exploded from the front window, shards scattering across the table. Caleb seized Eliza's shoulder and pulled her down as another bullet thudded into the wall. Smoke burned in her nostrils. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice steady as stone. He shoved a rifle into her hands. Her fingers shook. "I can't." "You won't have to," he cut in. "Just keep the cartridges dry." She clutched the box of ammunition, crawling on her knees across the floor as Caleb threw the door open and returned fire. The blast from his rifle split the evening, echoing across the flats. One rider cried out and tumbled from the saddle. The others spread wide, circling like wolves. Eliza ducked as bullets slammed into the siding. She dragged the baby's cradle into the farthest corner, then slipped cartridges into her dress pocket. Each time Caleb's rifle roared, she scrambled to hand him fresh rounds, her hands raw with splinters from the floor. The child wailed, piercing through the chaos. A shadow darkened the doorway. One of the attackers lunged inside, pistol raised, eyes burning. Eliza's throat tightened, but she did not freeze. She snatched a burning log from the hearth and thrust it toward his face. Sparks flew, smoke choking the room. The man cursed, stumbled back, and Caleb's revolver fired once, dropping him into the dust outside. "You think you can hide her forever?" A voice bellowed through the smoke. "She's marked, Ward. We'll burn you both out." Gunfire rattled the walls. Caleb staggered, his shoulder jerking as a bullet grazed flesh. Blood darkened his shirt. Eliza's cry caught in her throat, but Caleb pressed a hand to the wound and gritted his teeth. He fired again, steady, unflinching. 2 more riders wheeled away, horses screaming as bullets found their mark. At last the dust cleared, hoofbeats fading into the horizon. 3 men lay in the dirt beyond the fence, the others retreating into the dark. Caleb lowered his rifle, chest heaving. His shirt clung wet to his skin, blood trickling down his arm. Eliza dropped to his side, pressing a cloth to the wound. "You're hurt. It'll mend," he muttered. But his gray eyes softened as she tied the cloth tight, her hands stained crimson. She realized then that he bled for her, for the child, and the weight of that sacrifice hollowed her chest with both fear and something dangerously close to love. The night settled heavy, broken only by the child's restless whimper. They dragged the dead beyond the fence, patched the holes in the walls as best they could, and sat in the flicker of firelight, too weary to speak. Eliza's eyes stung, but not from smoke. They had survived, but Thomas's shadow still stretched long. It was a week later when another rider came. Not Thomas, but someone from Caleb's past. Jed Carver, lean, scarred, with the grin of a man who had seen too much of the borderlands. He rode up slow, dismounted with a clink of spurs, and stood at the fence as if he'd never left. Caleb walked out to meet him, revolver still on his hip. "Been a long time, Ward," Jed said, voice rough as gravel. He glanced toward the house where Eliza stood with her child. "Heard tell you're harboring a woman with a price on her head. Bounty rich enough to buy a whole valley. Split it, you and me. We'd never have to mend another fence. Caleb's eyes darkened, his stance unyielding. I don't trade people. Jed tilted his head, grin faltering. This ain't about people. It's about gold, land, a future. Caleb shook his head once, slow, final. His voice came like iron struck on an anvil. Some things ain't for sale. Not her, not the child. Silence stretched between them. Jed studied his old ally's face, searching for a crack, but found only stone. At last he spat into the dirt, swung into the saddle, and rode back into the horizon. Eliza watched from the doorway, heart trembling. She clutched the child close, realizing fully what Caleb had chosen. Not gold, not safety, but her. Yet victory felt thin. The town still muttered Thomas's lies, their whispers riding the wind. The storm was not over. It had only begun to gather. The storm rolled over Dry Creek like a wild beast, wind tearing shutters loose, rain pounding the rooftops until water streamed through the dirt streets like shallow rivers. Lanterns flickered in the church, its whitewashed walls groaning against the gale. Inside, townsfolk pressed close, voices raised against the roar of thunder. At the pulpit stood Thomas Monroe, soaked through, his fine coat plastered to his frame. His voice cut sharp through the clamor. "She deceived us all," he thundered. "Eliza Whitfield, a liar who carried another man's bastard. And Caleb Ward, that so-called savior, he's no more than a thief, stealing what never belonged to him." Murmurs spread, doubt and suspicion mingling with the storm's howl. Old resentments festered easily in the half-light. Outside, Caleb helped Eliza down from his horse, steadying her as she clutched the child against her breast. The church loomed before them, the place where her life had shattered, and now where it must be mended. Rain streamed from the brim of Caleb's hat, but his gaze was steady. Eliza met his eyes, heart pounding, and saw in them not command, but quiet strength. He nodded once. Together they pushed the doors open. The congregation turned, whispers sharp as knives. Eliza stood pale but unbroken, her child swaddled in her arms. Caleb's boots struck the floorboards, his silence filling the chamber like a challenge. Thomas's face flushed red. There he is, the pretender himself, dragging his shame back into God's house. His hand went to his revolver, eyes gleaming with triumph. "You'll regret this, Ward." The gun cleared leather, but Caleb was already moving. He stepped in front of Eliza, his revolver flashing from its holster. Thomas fired first, the shot splintering wood from the pulpit. Caleb's bullet struck the beam above Thomas's head, shards of timber exploding into his face. He staggered, weapon clattering to the floor. The church fell silent save for the storm rattling the roof. Thomas scrambled backward, pale and gasping, his arrogance stripped away. Caleb's voice broke the hush, calm but iron hard. "You call yourself a man of standing, but you left her at these steps. You'd see her and the child starve before you gave up your gold." Whispers stirred, softer now, uncertain. Eliza felt her chest tighten as the eyes of neighbors, once cold, once condemning, shifted from Thomas to her. "You saw the truth," Caleb went on, his gaze sweeping the room. "She wasn't fallen, she was abandoned. By him, by all of you. But she stood. She carried on. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman from the back, the same who had once drawn water beside Eliza, stepped forward and laid a hand on her shoulder. "I believe her," she whispered. Another followed, a shopkeeper who had traded with her late husband, then a rancher who had once turned his eyes away in scorn. One by one, they crossed the room, placing themselves between Eliza and Thomas. Thomas's face twisted with fury. "Fools," he spat. "You'll regret this." He stumbled toward the door, rain and thunder swallowing him whole. His name fell into the storm, carried away with the mud. The church quieted. Eliza's tears fell freely, not from despair but release. She looked at Caleb, his revolver lowered, his eyes softened in the lantern glow. He reached for her hand, rough and steady, grounding her. For the first time since the altar, she felt the weight of shame lift from her chest. She was no longer the abandoned bride. She was a survivor, standing with her child in the house where once she had been cast aside. Weeks passed, and the storm that had broken over Dry Creek seemed to wash more than mud from its streets. Whispers still lingered in doorways, but they carried less venom now. Thomas Monroe's name was spoken with scorn, his lies exposed, while Eliza's name was no longer followed by shame, but by quiet respect. At the ranch, life settled into a rhythm shaped by labor and the steady patience of survival. Caleb sold off a portion of his herd, the coins enough to buy timber and tools. With his own hands, he raised stronger walls, patched the roof so no storm could seep through again, and built a small room with a window that caught the morning light. Eliza found it one evening, the cradle carved of rough timber, uneven but sturdy, a quilt folded neatly at its foot. Her throat tightened as she traced the wood grain with her fingers. The child gurgled softly in her arms, reaching a small hand toward the cradle as if to claim it. She turned, meeting Caleb's eyes across the room. He said nothing, but his silence carried more weight than words. Later, as the fire burned low, she spoke the truth that had lived inside her since that first night. "I was left at the church steps with nothing but shame," she whispered. "But you gave me a home." Caleb paused in his work, the cloth in his hands stilled, his gaze lifted, steady and sure. He stepped closer, rough fingers brushing lightly across hers. His voice came low, certain. "Home ain't walls, Eliza. It's who you share the fire with." Her breath caught, and for the first time she let the words sink deep, free of fear. Home. Not borrowed, not bargained. Chosen. Spring came to the desert in its quiet way, grass greening along the flats, the sky wide and washed clean of winter storms. One morning, Caleb stepped onto the porch with the child in his arms, the infant's small fingers tangled in his shirt. Eliza stood beside him, shawl drawn close, her eyes lifted to the horizon where dawn broke in a blaze of gold. The baby gurgled softly, reaching a tiny hand toward the light. Caleb shifted his arms protectively, and Eliza's hand slipped into his. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, watching as the sun climbed higher, their shadows stretching long across the prairie. No longer an abandoned bride, no longer a man living only with ghosts, no longer a child hidden in shame. They were a family forged in dust and destiny, fragile once but steady now as the land beneath their feet. The past still lived in them, the blood spilled, the betrayals endured, the nights spent in fear, but it no longer ruled them. It had shaped them, tempered them, given weight to their choice. The past doesn't vanish, but we choose how to carry it. And in the wide silence of the West, beneath a sky that stretched without end, they carried it together. Three shadows bound by fire, by freedom, and by love. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.